Welcome to Press TV's debate. South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have reached an agreement on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The agreement was made on the second day of their summit in Pyongyang. North Korea also said that it will permanently close its main missile testing site if the U.S. takes reciprocal measures. Many are now wondering if Washington will take practical measures and respond to efforts made by the North Korean side in denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Joining us now on the discussion panel for tonight's debate is The Hill columnist Mr. Brent Badowski, joining us from Washington, D.C., and also political commentator Jason Unruhe is joining us from Niagara Falls, Ontario. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Badowski in Washington. Sir, the joint declaration was signed after 2 rounds of face-to-face talks. Both sides pledged to end hostilities, eliminate the risk of war, increase inter-Korean cooperation, and pursue a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Now, adding the U.S. as a variable to all this, how many of those goals are within grasp?
Well, it depends what the North Koreans want the U.S. to do. If what North Korea wants U.S. to do is reasonable, I think many of those items, possibly all of them, are within grasp. So the next question that has to be answered is what exactly are the reciprocal measures that North Korea would want the United States to do? I suspect at this moment President Moon is in touch with the U.S. officials, explaining whatever it is happened that's not public that will clarify that point. But I think the short version is there might be possible breakthrough. It is certainly possible. North Korea has a history, though, of offering things and not fulfilling them. And we really need to know what it is exactly, literally and specifically, they want the United States to do. But if it's acceptable, then there is the possibility of some dramatic progress. If not, we'll be back where we started, and we'll just have to see.
All right, let's bring in Mr. Unruhe from Ontario. Mr. Unruhe, Mr. Badowski thinks that there is room for progress. What do you think about what he just mentioned?
Well, I think that there definitely is room for progress, so that we can have a much more peaceful situation on the Korean Peninsula. I think this really comes down to is the same problem that has existed since these kinds of negotiations have been done. The DPRK made certain pledges. We are willing to cooperate as long as we receive something in return. The problem is the United States has not been coming with many of those concessions, including removing many of the sanctions that have been placed unjustly against the country for simply not willing to cooperate with U.S. imperial interests. The problem here is that the DPRK has these nuclear weapons for a very specific reason, as deterrent against U.S. invasion and threats by the United States, which has been made against the country for since essentially the unofficial end of the Korean War. Now, the DPRK has to keep that in mind when they are willing to make any kinds of concessions. To give up their nuclear weapons is to give up a significant piece of the Juche policy, the Songun policy of placing the military first as a measure of defense. But as we saw with the meeting that took place earlier this year with Donald Trump, we saw many words of progress, but no real actions from either side. The DPRK is not willing to simply get rid of their nuclear weapons until they can receive some kind of assurances or some kind of actions from the United States.
Mr. Badowski, the U.S. has also stated that it's hoping for meaningful denuclearization moves from North Korea. What about the North? What should they be hoping for? Or, in other words, what can they be hoping for?
Well, what they should be hoping for, and hopefully they are, is an agreement ultimately including the United States where there are step-by-step actions taken at the same time. Certainly, if North Korea is going to denuclearize, they should get guarantees for their security in return. So on one level, I think if everything else is agreed, there could be a formal agreement that would literally end the Korean War, which still has not happened. I don't agree that the sanctions were wrong, but I think what could easily happen is to the degree that North Korea takes verifiable actions to step-by-step lower their nuclear capability, the United States could equally and at the same time take step-by-step actions to withdraw the sanctions bit by bit. So both countries would act at the same time. Concessions would come from both countries at the same time. what both countries would be getting and what both countries would do would both be executed in stages at the same time. So that way, there's good faith build. It's called a confidence building measure. But they could be potentially significant to the degree that North Korea is willing to take actions that are verifiable and proven. The United States should take equal actions of equal importance that are equally verifiable and proven. And that could easily involve a beginning to lift the sanctions at the same time that North Korea begins to denuclearize. And they do it in stages. They do it together. They do it at the same time. They do it equally. That would be the ultimate framework for a bigger final agreement that ultimately would include what North Korea wants and the United States should and would agree to under the right circumstances, a formal treaty ending the war once and for all. It's kind of ridiculous after all these years. We don't have that yet, and we should, if the other actions can be agreed to, and if action can be taken by both sides in stages together to prove to the other that they're good for the deal.
Mr. Unruhe, can the North Koreans be expecting to see much from the United States?
Frankly, I don't really see much forthcoming from the United States. I mean, my colleague there on the other side is very right when he says that there must be overtures from both sides in order to reach a kind of agreement. Essentially, we're left in a kind of situation where the DPRK can give up its nuclear weapons, but can't just all of a sudden get them back, whereas the U.S. can get rid of the sanctions and then immediately place them right back on them if they don't get what they want. In other words, the DPRK is kind of in the weakened position here. But I think that overall this can be positive. This can go in the right direction. This can go in a means towards peace. Essentially, the DPRK has been asking for the end of the Korean War for many decades now. They've wanted to essentially get past it. They've wanted to continue to have grow a positive relationship with the South. Just recently, they attempted to build a railway between the two countries, specifically for economic cooperation, which would necessitate laying track through the demilitarized zone, which the UN did not give them permission to do, which is very strange, considering the UN is supposed to be about promoting peace, and yet here they are deliberately sabotaging that. But I think that it's a very big question as to whether or not the United States would actually carry out much of what it says that it's willing to concede to the DPRK. I don't think the DPRK has much reason to trust the United States, especially considering its foreign policy these last many decades. But positive steps can be made if both sides are willing to act in good faith.
And in a follow-up, Mr. Unruhe, the joint declaration and the separate agreement on easing military tensions aims at, quote-unquote, eliminating the risk of war. Many would say that that very risk of war is what the U.S. has been banking on for decades when it comes to the Korean Peninsula.
Well, I would certainly agree with that statement that the DPRK is consistently concerned about being attacked by the United States. Since the end of the Korean War, the war is still technically there. They are still under threat from some kind of U.S. action, which what necessitated the creation of the Songon military first policy to make the absolute priority of the country national defense. In the past, that has taken the manifestation of massed troops along the border, large amounts of artillery aimed at the south. But the more recent manifestation has been the nuclear weapons. Hopefully, with this step towards peace, eliminating much of the threat, much of the posturing, maybe ending U.S. drills in the area, simulating the invasion of the North, or as they say, a defense from an attack by the North. Hopefully, that with these kinds of provocative acts kept down to a minimum or possibly eliminated altogether, there can definitely be more good faith between all three sides, because it seems like this is really an issue that should be taking place between the North and the South, and yet the United States in its hegemonic position feels that it has the moral authority to make kinds of demands in this situation.
Mr. Badowski, your thoughts on that? Eliminating the risk of war can increase trust between the three players here. That's according to our guest, Mr. Unruhe in Ontario.
Oh, I think that's correct. I don't think any party in this whole thing, North Korea, South Korea, or the United States, or the democratic neighbors in Asia, I don't think anybody should trust anybody. I think they do and should distrust each other in terms of North Korea versus the other countries. On the other hand, there are actions that North Korea can take. They would be verifiable. That's an important word, that it would be guaranteed that they have taken those actions. And in return, there are actions North Korea can ask for in return for them that they would be able to verify from the United States and any other countries in the region. I think it's definitely possible on a step-by-step basis to move towards a denuclearization and a peaceful peninsula and security for both North and South Korea and the United States. So I think that is doable. Now, I will add, by the way, I'm a Democrat. I've been a critic on many issues of President Trump. Not only do I not speak for the administration at all, but you might call me a member of the resistance, as they say here. But having said that, I think President Trump would probably respond in good faith with support from Democrats and Republicans to legitimate concessions by North Korea that are verifiable, and offer legitimate concessions by the United States in return that would be verifiable by North Korea. I do think that is possible, and I would think everyone should at least give President Trump a chance, because I do think there's some possibility that would be fairly high that he would respond to genuine concessions by North Korea with genuine concessions by the United States that both parties in Congress would back him up on. That's my opinion, and I don't normally agree with him, but I want to be fair to the president and urge everybody, not trusting each other, but to make offers in good faith. They can be verifiable, they can be mutual, they can be executed at the same time, stage by stage, and if that happens, there is hope that today's events could lead to something important for all countries involved.
Mr. Unruhe, what do you think? Has Trump's unorthodox approach paid off?
I think that Trump certainly has had his own unique approach to it, although I would very question how valuable it's actually been. The meeting coming out of Singapore gave nice, lofty words about peace, but nothing actually came of it. Now, something can come of it. I think that it's very possible if President Trump were to increase his diplomatic skills in dealing with complex political issues like this, it's possible that there can be a positive outcome. The main thing here, the reason why the DPRK has the nuclear weapons, has the nuclear deterrent, is because they are under threat from the United States. If that threat could be eliminated, if there could be some kind of guarantee of ceasing hostilities, no longer seeking the regime change formula, then the DPRK would not have a reason to have the nuclear deterrent that it has. And I think that that's the big question here, is as to whether or not that trust can be formulated between the two countries. I am a very big critic of the limited diplomatic skills of Donald Trump and whether or not this is something that he can carry out. I think this is perhaps something that would be delegated to someone with much more experience inside of his administration. Hopefully someone who can handle situations in this manner better than Trump does himself.
And let's get a final word in from you gentlemen. Will Washington feel bound by the results of these inter-Korean summits? Mr. Badowski, your thoughts, 30 seconds or less.
I think Washington values our relationship with South Korea. I think the president and everyone in Washington wants to have denuclearization and wants an agreement that North Korea can accept. So I think the answer is yes, there is possibility. It has to be step by step. It can begin with the first steps very soon. And there are people such as Secretary of Defense James Mattis who have tremendous expertise and knowledge about this and would favor a fair, balanced diplomatic solution that both countries can ultimately agree to and advance on.
Mr. Unruhe, final thoughts from you, sir?
I would tend to agree largely with that statement. There is a room for peace. There is a room for improvement between the two countries. The DPRK has to be given some kind of guarantee or promise or some kind of manifestation of protection from invasion by the United States, subversive activities, etc., and the DPRK would no longer have the necessity for having nuclear weapons in order to defend itself. Whether or not that can be manifested is something that remains to be seen in the future, but there is a possibility of peace.
All right, I believe we're going to have to leave it there. Allow me to thank my guests for the program, Mr. Brent Badowski, the Hilm columnist, joining us from Washington, D.C., and also political commentator, Mr. Jason Unruhe, joining us from Niagara Falls, Ontario. And with that, we're going to wrap it up here on this edition of Press TV's Debate. Thanks for watching, everybody, and good night.